You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today I'm joined by Jason Howarth. Jason is the founder and currently the Chief Product Officer at Veya, although from what Jason tells me that role fluctuates a little bit from time to time, as founders' roles do. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today, Jason.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for inviting me.
We'll launch right into this because Veya's probably not particularly well known in the conveyancing market at the moment. And the question on everybody's lips by the end of this conversation will be, where on earth did the name come from? Because it flies frighteningly close to Veyo, which was, of course, the ill-fated Law Society initiative. But tell us initially, where does the idea for Veya come from? Tell us a little bit about what it is that you're doing.
Of course, well, so it starts way back in 2013. Funnily enough, so it takes a while for these to come to fruition. So I was working as a consultant in financial services, and my youngest was born, and I thought, you know what, actually this is great, but I didn't have a pension at that point in time, and I had no other real assets. So everybody was kind of jumping onto the buy-to-let wagon. So I thought, okay, let's do that. Sounds reasonable. And bear in mind, I hadn't bought a property for quite some years prior to that, so I thought it'd be fairly straightforward. So where I'm based, David, we could still, there's a lot of terrace properties that are very reasonably priced, or they were in 2013. So embarked on that sort of journey, really. I identified some, went to the viewings, and kind of quite typically, I guess, the estate agent would wax lyrical about what the property had, and it's got parking, and it's got this, and it's got that. In hindsight, they didn't really understand if it was leasehold or the term or anything like that. But anyway, by the by. So we'd find a property, say, yeah, okay, that's great. We put an offer in, offer got negotiated, accepted. We'd start down the journey, and then obviously what usually kind of around eight weeks in, I guess, is where the conveyancer would do their initial title report back to us and say, this is what you've got, this is what you've not got. And we'd sit there and go, no, we've got parking allocated because the estate agents told us that. And the conveyancer would look at me and go, no, you haven't. You don't own that. That is owned by the property 2 doors down. You haven't got this. You've still got a right of access for someone to drag their bins across the backyard every Thursday. I'm like, well, I don't want that then. That's not very appealing to a tenant, is it? So we would invariably, on a number of occasions, we'd pull out at that point, David. And, because that wasn't what we'd been led to believe we were actually buying. So it kind of got the better of me in the fact that I'm quite process orientated. So I thought, right, you know what? And this happened a number of times to us before we finally sort of bought some properties. But bear in mind, David, it took us over 18 months to get the first buy to let because we kept going through this cycle. It was a nightmare, right? So I thought, right, the only way to really kind of understand this is let's set up our own estate agency. So with the help of the wife and some local resource and knowledge, we set up an estate agency, not to be the biggest, not to grow massively. It was genuinely to really understand why this was happening. So over the course of a few months, I still had my day job. So over the evening, I would sit there and I kind of map this stuff out and understand what had gone on during the days. And go, well, actually, if we did that there and I did that there, what would that do? And we started to trial different things, really, very manually in our own estate agency. And the kind of light bulb moment came when we started to really understand a little bit about title registers. And so within that document, David, is kind of a wealth of information that a lot of agents kind of just totally disregard, right? They say title, it's a legal document, it's nothing to do with me, it's a conveyancer's role. Well, kind of, but kind of not, because apart from anything else, it's a key and vital document in proving ownership. Okay, so when you're sat in the living room and you're doing the appraisal, that is one of the very key documents that an agent should be using. So okay, you've got the ownership, but sometimes it's not always that black and white. It could be that, yeah, okay, two people own the property, but then actually there's a trustee involved and there might be an interim charging order involved. So actually all these, from an ownership point of view, you've got legal owners, but you've also got people with a legal and equitable interest in it, right? And obviously that starts to go into legal speak then. So as an agent level, that started to go over my head a little bit. I'm like, I kind of get it, but I don't. And that was kind of where the idea of Veya was born. It's like, well, do you know what? If we could understand these and simplify it, so it's not doing the role of conveyancer by any stretch, but as an agent, it's just really simplifying it into layperson's terms. What does that mean to me? And what does that mean to the buyer, the seller, and ultimately the transaction, David? Because let's be honest, as an agent, if I couldn't get that transaction over the line or the team couldn't, we weren't getting paid. So, and obviously the buyer, the seller, they all want to move quickly. So that was kind of where the idea came from. It was born from our own pains, proven out in our own estate agency, and then towards the latter years is automated to what Veya is today.
And Veya is an automated sort of title report of some description then, Jason?
Yeah, so what it does at its core is it does exactly that. We enter just property, a very basic property address, and it talks only to land registry, because we're only interested, is that property registered or is it not? That's the first question we need to know. Once it kind of ascertains and it comes back and says, yeah, okay, I am registered, I add that to my portfolio in Veya, and then it's looking for the common scenarios that are going to come out. So it'll look at ownership, it will look at, are there restrictions on the title? Are there things that can impact the sale? i.e., part of the land might have been sold off and is now resident on another title, or I've got a farmhouse and it's linked to a building and a garage. So, but it simplifies all of that. So in doing that as well, David, what it does is it's got quite an intelligent scoring system that, again, it's not to the nth detail, but it allows anybody to pick that report up and look at it and go, okay, this is either sort of low, medium, or high complexity. There are things in here, if it's high, that are going to be quite challenging to probably get this transaction over the line, taking the chain to one side. And what that then enables an estate agent to do, David, is a couple of things, right? Is if I start to understand that, and I understand it's high risk before I've walked through the door, I can really weave that into my conversation, so not only, it's a lovely 4-bed detached Mrs. Jones with a nice kitchen and a nice view, it's you weave some of this in and say, for example, I've noticed that your garden's a little bit irregular shapes, but we know because it got sold off, right? So that property over there, and the vendor literally sits there, David, and goes, how did you know that? Well, that's why you've invited us out, and that's why we're a 2% or a 2.5% agent, because we understand, and we can, with some of these other things we've identified, okay, listen, let's not worry about it because we know about it and we're best placed to help you. So what we did as well is we tried and tested, David, is flexing our fee according to the complexities that we could see in the register, and we could absolutely justify that. So we'd sit there and say, actually, here's a really simple one. There's nothing in it. It's great. Do you know what? We can do this for 1%. We're fine with that. Whereas we go and we see one that was maybe unregistered or was just really complex, and we're like, listen, we're at 2%, but this is why we're at 2% for this one. And then from a sales progression perspective, David, obviously when it's into the conveyancing is, so again, instead of Mrs. Jones phoning up being totally, what's happening, we could be very proactive and go, right, Mrs. Jones, we need to understand, we can see there's a trust involved. We need to understand who's party to the trust. We need to understand, we need to get them to agree the sales contract. We need to do ID&V. So from a compliance point of view as well, David, we really did know our customer, and we really did understand what we were taking on at the point of taking it on. And that just benefited the estate agency massively, and it kind of grew a little bit too big. It was never the intention, and eventually we wound it down. But still, to this day, we get people messaging me going, "Oh, blah blah, you've been referred. Can you list our property?" And I'm like, "Oh, sorry, don't do it anymore." But that it's just such a wealth of information in there, and it's a shame that agents don't. I think part of the reason is, David, it's viewed as a legal document in its own right, and some of it can be quite complex, right? So agents don't want to be conveyancers don't want to be agents. Absolutely, you don't. But it's just having that bit of knowledge that can just really help you.
There's a huge drive in the estate agency world, and indeed in the conveyancing world, to improve the amount of information that's available up front, which is very largely what you're talking about, isn't it? Improving the information that's available up front. There's I get this sense that Veya actually takes what is being proposed, A, B, and C, by the National Trading Standards and Estate Agents and Lettings team. It takes that a step further. I mean, do you think that the proposals go far enough? Do you think that actually agents need to be better armed to get hold of this material information up front?
Yeah, and it's a good question, David. And obviously, as of today, the full standards haven't been released. But from what we can see, the way we understand it is Section 8, I believe, is kind of largely covered by what an agent does today, or certainly within their CRMs. It should be pulling that through. B and C, yeah, they start to talk about now about restrictive covenants and easements. So I think that's a really good thing, right? Because that's kind of what Veya is helping bring to the surface. But where an agent, I think, is going to struggle then is, so I go out, I take a property on, I list it, and for example, I pull the title and I take the time to painstakingly go through it and go, or there's a data set that tells me there's restrictive covenants, etc. That's great. But what's the first question a buyer is going to ask me, David? They're going to go, I can see there's a restrictive covenant. What does it mean to me? How's an agent going to answer that question? How are they going to understand how that affects a transaction? Could be something within that transaction that could limit the number of lenders. All right. So it could be a certain restriction that certain lenders go, if we look at their risk profile, they go, well, we wouldn't lend against that. Yeah, I could have little Johnny come 2 weeks later with a decision in principle from that very lender, right? And today we're going to let him go all the way down the journey until the point where they turn around and go, no, we're not lending. And how many weeks have we wasted? So the upfront information, I think, is really good and is really valid. It's either adopt to some of the tools like Veya, or there's going to have to be some significant upskilling within an agency.
You said that conveyancers don't want to be agents don't want to be conveyancers. I think that's very true. They're two very different skill sets. But to some extent, what you're proposing here is that agents actually become a much or could become a much bigger part of the conveyancing process.
Yes, absolutely. So again, it kind of goes way back to the start, right? So if we used to sit there and we would understand that, like I say, maybe there was a trust involved, maybe there's some other elements to it. It could be something, David, like there's a CCJ registered against a title, right? And you could have a Mr. and Mrs. Whereas it could be Mr. or Mrs. might not even know about that CCJ, all right? So it then becomes a really sensitive situation and a duty of care, because actually selling their property might not be in the best interest, right? But the fact that I understand this at the start, when we get a sale, when we pass the memo of sale over to Conveyancer, we weren't just passing, and our customers are not just passing the memo of sale now. They're going, here's the memo of sale, here's the official copy of register and plan, and here's the very report, which just surfaces some of the things initially. So as part of that, for example, here you go, the title said that they were not married when they bought the property, so it was still in a maiden name. They've since got married. Do you know what? We've already got the marriage certificate certified, and here you go. So to a conveyancer, it's like they're so kind of grateful to receive that information. Obviously, they're going to check it. Of course, they are. That's their role, right? But to just go, brilliant. So they now understand some of that back history, and it just gives them an upper leg. So you can start to cut down, some of those sort of unnecessary inquiries that people, you see it on LinkedIn all the time, right? I've been asked to inquire about all this different stuff. You can start to cut some of that down. And what we saw, and some of our clients are seeing now, is that end-to-end time is coming down significantly. because we've done things like we've got the marriage certificate, we've identified all the people party to the trust, we've done all of that. Absolutely, you guys are going to do it again in conveyancing world, but now you know who it is. You're not starting up cold.
You identified in the course of the conversation that actually having this information to hand enabled you to flex your fees as an estate agent. To my mind, having this information as part of a conveyancing fee triage is going to enable conveyancers to do the same thing, actually to say, look, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, we know from the information that we've been provided that this is going to be a more complex case and therefore our fees are reflective of that, rather than this sliding scale that many conveyancers use based on the value of the property.
Yes, 100%. And interestingly, David, so we've just recently got into conveyancing market as well, and that's kind of exactly what they're looking at for Veya, to go, okay, even from an initial quoting aspect, right, you could start to bring this in, because the quoting method is kind of blind. They don't really understand what they're quoting on, right? Is it freehold, is it leasehold, is it? And again, sometimes the people who are asking for them quotes don't know either, right? Because they've not had the information. So that absolute triage is key, because Veya kind of does its initial analysis, and based on the complexity scoring, it allows the conveyancers to go, actually, that is more suited to Steve in the corner, because he knows all about, the kind of issues or the risks that have been identified here, rather than today, sometimes they're just given to a conveyancer who maybe is fresh out of training, right? So that triage and that whole onboarding is absolutely key in helping the conveyancing firms that we're working with. And it's not just conveyancing firms, David, as well. So you look at it, and again, we're talking to equity release firms. All these people need to understand the title, right? To understand, if I'm doing equity release, but they don't want there to be something in there, that's going to cause them a problem later on. But 9 times out of 10, when they're having that conversation with a person, they don't know that. They're just not armed with that information.
It's interesting that, Jason. I'd not really thought about the benefit from a resourcing point of view, that actually pointing the case at somebody that's perhaps got more experience or more skill in something, leasehold or new build, for example, alongside the quotation side of things. You also touched on onboarding and compliance. We did a podcast with Paul Offley, who's the Group Compliance Officer at Nurture, which is Fine and Country and the Guild of Property Agents. And he's a big exponent of using the title to actually verify the ownership as well, as part of your IDV and anti-money laundering processes.
We've partnered with Third Fort, who offer a very integrated solution to Veya, and a complementary one. So you can also perform AML, IDV, and source of funds within Veya. What Veya does is it pulls through the names exactly from the register initially, anyway. So there's no kind of miskeying. There's nothing where you can go wrong there, or miss a middle name or anything like that. So when it's doing the verification, we know that we've got those details correct, right? We can also start to bring that back in and look for anomalies and any sort of red flags. So let's say it was a sole ownership with no mortgage, and there was no restriction that prevents, that needs a secondary signatory or anything like that. So we can start to really help an agent and go, listen, there's a heightened risk of fraud with this transaction, right? Because there's no restriction, it's a sole proprietor, etc., etc.
You talked about Veya crossing over into the conveyancing arena and the benefits potentially for conveyancers. How do you see that developing over the course of the next few years in your role as Chief Product Officer, amongst many other things?
Many other things. So we're doing a lot around onboarding with these guys at the minute, and that's really interesting, even to a point of looking at the flows, right, and going, right, okay, let's understand at what point you take monies in account. Let's understand at what point you do ID&B. What point do you call the register? And again, it kind of taking me back to the 2013 days, is just mapping this thing out and then going, actually, it kind of, if we did that here, that would make more sense. Efficiency would improve, your compliance would improve. So today, we're very focused on onboarding. Going forward, I absolutely see, David, that it will go into more of the sort of the conveyancing role. So at the minute, we're kind of pre-conveyancer, if that makes sense. We're doing all the supporting work to help them. Then we'll start to look at conveyancers and say, right, okay, let's now understand, we can see some of the pain points in your world. And I absolutely think Veya can help address some of those. Again, even some of the simple things like, we've got to request a redemption statement. So you know what? Okay, let's automate that call out. Let's automate that. You don't have to, we shouldn't have to be logging into a lender's portal that times out after 20 seconds or whatever it is, right? It's insane. Let's just make the call. We'll do it. We'll return it to you. So it's not taking away that role of a conveyancer, but it's just meaning that they become that much more efficient. And obviously, if you become more efficient, then the high volume of cases now becomes more sort of amenable to be able to get through them, instead of just having a load stacked, where, and it just delays. So, but yeah, the other side is financial services. So my background working with the Big Four, again, I saw some of the pain points from their side of the fence from a consumer. So we can start to understand, would that lender lend against his property, or would it require indemnities? Let's start to flush that out. And ultimately, this will probably all culminate in a consumer offering as well, David, because if I'm a buyer and I see a property listing and it says it's got restrictive covenants, and I go to the agent and for whatever reason they can't help me kind of explain, then having a simple Veyo report on my phone that does explain, it could save me literally hundreds, thousands of pounds, right, in surveys and all the rest of it, to find out at the end, well, do you know what, I wanted to run this type of business, but there's a restriction and I can't do that, or the lender won't lend against that sort of restriction. It's heartbreaking, right? And ultimately that's costing the UK economy millions, because that deal falls through, then the removal guy doesn't get paid, the carpet guy, right, it's kind of endless. So yeah, that's how I see it building out.
We're certainly starting to see the portals, Rightmove, Zoopla, on the market adopt more of this information, isn't it? So I suppose the utopia for you is actually having a Veya listing on Zoopla or something like that, I would guess.
Yeah. So yeah, kind of rubber stamped by Veya before it kind of gets there. And yeah, we are in conversations with portals, funnily enough.
That's as much as we've got time for today, but it's been really interesting chatting, Jason. Thanks so much for your time. I am going to ask you the question: Veya, Veyo, unplanned, deliberate? What's the connection?
Totally unplanned. The name came about because we ran a customer focus group, so we showed customers very early on prototypes, and we said, we need to find a name. So Veya came out, and it kind of, someone said, conveyancer. Surveyor, so that's how it kind of came around, and we're like, oh yeah, that kind of fits really. So yeah, totally unrelated.
Totally unplanned. Fair enough. Thanks so much for joining the Today's Conveyancer podcast.
Thank you, David.
It's available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on the Today's Conveyancer website. Jason, delighted to have you on. Thanks so much, and thank you very much indeed for listening. See you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.